So now, Buddhologists, we're going to end our journey with our 7th installment of Global Buddhism as we look at how Buddhism enters the West and transforms it, and in what ways. This unit affects me personally. I studied at Northwestern University with a Japanese professor and first learned the mind-transforming philosophy of Nagarjuna, and then finished with my dissertation on Buddhist tenet systems of Central Asia with my advisor Geshe Lundhup Sopa from Tibet. So from Tokyo to Tibet, I learned the world of Buddhism is quite diverse, as our first 6 units have, I hope, demonstrated. We may recall in our 3rd unit with the emergence of the Mahayana that the West has been involved with Buddhism for 2,300 years. Since the invasion of Alexander the Great took down the mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire, this begins the mingling of Greek with Indian thinkers, and this includes Buddhist thinkers. In 325 before the Common Era, as we may remember, Alexander the Great has conquered all of the former Persian Empire up to northwest India. And there he establishes Greco-Bactrian kingdoms, a mixture of Indians, Greeks, and Scythians. And this is the first known contact, really, of Europe with the West. There is some mention of India by Herodotus, but the first real compelling influence can be seen in the philosophers that Alexander the Great encounters, and in some cases brings back to Greece with him. According to accounts of philosophers such as Pyrrho, for example, the Greeks encountered an extreme form of asceticism. These monks wore no clothes, so were likely Digambara Jains. In one instance, one of them was about to die. Sensing his imminent death, he built his own funeral pyre and then lit it and got on top and immolated himself, which shocked the Greeks. Let's look at just a few basic doctrines of some Greek schools that may have been influenced by Buddhism. We start with the skeptical school of Pyrrho, and Diogenes Laertius explains that his equanimity and calm he acquired in India, as well his idea of suspending all judgment, hence the word skepticism, echoes the kind of skeptical thinking we saw with Nagarjuna, but in the teaching of the Buddha himself, to doubt everything, even his own words, as we may recall from the Kalama Sutra. With cynicism, we see that the avoidance of either pleasure or pain are to be avoided. Cynicism also has some connection with India, and in terms of doctrine, cynicism urges refraining from indulging in either pleasure or pain, which reminds us perhaps of the Buddha's own equanimity to avoid extremes of pain or pleasure, as evinced in his own existence, rejected the hedonism of palace life and rejected the asceticism of his practices subsequently prior to becoming the Buddha. Stoicism, again like Buddhism, rejects the idea of classism that we saw with the Hindu tradition and the caste system, and then freeing oneself from passion and practicing daily meditation is a definition of Buddhism. Many Greeks in the Indo-Greek kingdoms will convert to Buddhism, among other Indian traditions. And of course, after Alexander the Great's empire fades away, the Mauryan Empire of Ashoka, the great emperor of Buddhism, will take over, and he will send missionaries out throughout the known world, including to Yavana or Ionia or Greece. According to the Mahavamsa, the great Sri Lankan chronicle of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, 30,000 Ionians, Greeks, helped to dedicate the Ruwan Welisia in Anuradhapura, the capital. The Mauryan dynasty itself will fade away as empires due to be replaced by the Central Asian Kushana Empire, where we see the emergence of the Buddha image in this empire, this civilization, from primarily Greek sources, although also Indian ones in the south. In the north, however, we see the Buddha appearing as the Greek god Apollo in many sculptures. And this tradition will spread from Japan to Sri Lanka and everywhere in between, the building of Buddha images. And of course, the major engine driving Buddhism throughout Eurasia is the Silk Road. And the Silk Road will bring merchants and philosophers from China to Greece and everywhere in between, creating a very rich cultural mixture in Central Asia. And the emergence, of course, of the Mahayana traditions of Buddhism. Some look perhaps in vain to find influences of Buddhism in other classic scriptures as well, such as the Christian New Testament, where we can find Paul the Apostle writing about the emptiness of Christ on the cross. When we look at the key word kenosis, this means emptiness and is actually a cognate, kenem with shinum or zero. So the kind of emptying isn't the classic Christian definition of Christ getting rid of all his powers to save himself and becoming human. But if we take it in this Buddhist sense of emptying, Christ emptied himself completely of ego on the cross and did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. And we may remember the grasping skandhas of the self are what drive us along in this world of passion and confusion. That may be a stretch, but there certainly were Buddhist thinkers from Egypt to Greece at that time in that region. And for evidence, we need look no further than St. Clement of Alexandria, who specifically mentions disciples of a man named Buddha. And he even mentions Shramanas, or strivers, if you will, a reference to Buddhist strivers who had appeared from Bactria. So even ancient Egypt was abuzz with the Buddha. He even, we're told, debated some of the followers, and he said they were very clever, but they did not know Christ. So with Gnosticism, I think, if not Buddhism, definitely the influence of Indian religious thinking was felt in the Mediterranean world. We can see here again another reference to emptiness from the Gospel of Thomas. People are blind because they do not see that empty they come into this world and empty they leave. As well, it's in Egypt that we see the emergence of the Christian monastic movement with the arrival of Saint Benedict. He is the first in the West, and certainly the first among Abrahamic traditions, to establish the idea of celibate men living together according to rules they follow. And these monastic movements of Egypt will become powerfully influential economically as well as politically and culturally, and subsequently throughout all of Asia. But the similarity to the Buddhist monastic order kind of can't be missed, I think. Marco Polo brings back to medieval Europe the story of the Buddha couched in the frame of a story about Barlaam and Josaphat, or Bilawar and Buddhasaph. The point is, Josaphat is Bodhisat, Bodhisattva, another reference of the Buddha, as well as the Mahayana salvation figure we discussed in units 3 and 5. According to this story, Josaphat sits under a tree until he finally has a vision of Christ. Kind of sounds familiar, don't you think? In Islam, that same old Kushana Empire, though ravaged by Islamic incursion, will also be the source of Sufi Islam. In Sufism, one seeks to acquire the same mental awareness that Muhammad had, and they are famous for their whirling dancing to incite meditations that ideally will lead them to fana, which is the destruction of the self. That sounds familiar, and of course, Sufi Islam is generally not accepted by the other two main branches of Muslims, Shia and Sunni. So those doctrines are heretical, as are the Gnostic ones in Christianity. But the idea that Buddhism made no impact on that Western world seems like a farther stretch than speculating about possible connections. Then, through subsequent centuries, the Islamic world will kind of cut a wedge between East Eurasia and Western Eurasia. So contact with the West slims down until the colonial period, when we see St. Francis Xavier traveling to Japan, for example, and he asks, "What are those monks thinking about?" And in whimsical Zen style, Buddhist abbot Nunzio said, "Some think of pastimes, others how much they took from the faithful, others how they could do better at another monastery. They are thinking of nothing that makes sense." So this is the kind of joking disregard for appropriateness and formality that we see in the Zen tradition as St. Francis meets with practitioners of the Japanese tantric school, Shingon, with their idea of Mahavairochana, the great illumination that pervades all reality. They could see perhaps that the Christian God through Christ was an esoteric or an imaginary deity of tantric tradition. But the idea of dying on a cross to save other people violates every Buddhist idea from among all the three major revolutions of doctrine. And subsequently, the Japanese will ban this cult. It will go underground, only to re-emerge in the World War II period. Then Dominican missionary Father Alexander pens his own description of nirvana based on his travels in China. For him, Buddhism is unalloyed atheism. The void, which they consider to be the principle of all things, is, they say, completely perfect and tranquil, without beginning or end, unmoving, without knowledge, without desire, reducing everything to a confused void with a simple nothing as its beginning and end, and considers that perfection consists in perfect indifference, apathy, and undisturbed quietude. So the Catholic missionaries declared Buddhism anathema. It violated all Catholic teachings. King Louis XIV sent an envoy to Siam, modern-day Thailand, and he too describes the salvation state of the Buddhists. Nireopan, nirvana, is not a place, but a way of being. Nirupan, they say this soul has disappeared. It will not return again to any world. And it is this word that the Portuguese have translated as follows: it is annihilated. It has become God. Even though, according to the Siamese, it is neither annihilation nor divinization. And in the later colonial period, we'll see Protestants getting in on this action. I might suggest the Protestants were considerably friendlier towards Buddhism, perhaps the individualism of the two traditions, the rejection of religious authorities apart from the individual might be some reasons. But he declares Zazen is a profound meditation of the divine, mysterious, and holy things. They take up a man's mind, his body lies destitute of all sense and life, unmoved by any external object whatsoever. So the missionaries in the colonial period were not impressed by Buddhism, but as the centuries wear on, we'll find some majorly influential Western thinkers embracing Buddhist thinking explicitly. One of these will not be Ralph Waldo Emerson, who instead will be influenced by Hindu thinking in terms of the Brahman world spirit of which we are all a part. But for him, like the Catholic missionaries, the idea of emptiness or no self were depressing. This remorseless Buddhism lies all around, threatening with death and night. Every thought, every enterprise, every sentiment has its ruin in this horrid infinite which circles us and awaits our dropping into it. A much more positive view of Buddhism can be found in the life and writings of Henry David Thoreau. He very explicitly equates the love of many for Christ with his own love of the Buddha, and declared the Lotus Sutra his favorite scripture. And as well, famously, he lived the life essentially of an early monk in the wilderness, living alone in the woods on his own, recapitulating the lifestyle of the very earliest Buddhists. Arthur Schopenhauer is often blamed for Buddhism getting this wrong reputation as world-denying or pessimistic. He embraced Buddhism and even compared an awakening he had in his adolescence to the Buddha's own awakening. But his interpretation of Buddhism saw reality as a devouring monster, and the only escape is within, cutting oneself off from the universe, which is hardly the teaching of the Buddha, but it does inspire future thinkers to think about Buddhism. But it does inspire future Western thinkers in terms of their own thinking about Buddhism. Friedrich Nietzsche will take Schopenhauer's world-denying interpretation of Buddhism to heart and critique it in his Also sprach Zarathustra, thus spoke Zarathustra, where the Buddha's own message will be rejected in favor of a self-affirming existentialism, for which Nietzsche is famous. But he rejected the no-self doctrine as well as world-denying. Meanwhile, in America, the Protestant Henry Steele Olcott, a retired Northern Army's colonel and Presbyterian, meets up with Madame Blavatsky, famously, the founder of Theosophy. And those two will travel through India, and he will slowly move away from her New Age-ism, if you will, seances and spirits and the like, towards an increasingly formal and standard form of Buddhism. And for him, as for many of these early Western thinkers, it's the rationalism of Buddhism that appeals to them. There is no heaven or hell. There is no all-powerful being who fails to solve problems in our world. So a lot of the entrance of Westerners into Buddhism is intellectual. Olcott will help develop the Buddhist flag, in fact, of Sri Lanka. And even today, Sri Lanka's Independence Day is dedicated to Henry Steele Olcott, who warned the Buddhist world in Burma, Japan, and Sri Lanka, where he was welcomed with open arms. He warned the Buddhist world to beware the colonialists and their missionaries, and even created a Buddhist catechism to help Buddhists argue with Catholic missionaries. Anagarika Dharmapala will travel the world and become quite the hot topic in Europe and America as he travels about giving speeches about Buddhism and teaching the traditions from Sri Lanka. And he not only participated in the liberation of Sri Lanka from British rule, but also initiated Buddhist revivals in India itself. T.W. Rhys Davids will found the Pali Text Society, and as Protestants are wont to do, starts to create translations of the text, just as Martin Luther had done with the Bible into German so many centuries earlier. Rhys Davids is in particular associated with what is called Protestant Buddhism, where some Protestants will just superimpose Buddhism onto Protestantism as if getting rid of God or the atonement of Christ were easily discarded. But again, the individualism and rationalism of Buddhism as they saw it appealed to them greatly. The Sri Lankan Buddhist scholar Gananath Abeysekera describes Protestant Buddhism as the freedom of the individual conscience for a focus on interior experience, and was itself a protest against Christian hegemony in the colonial world at that time. The Light of Asia will become a best-selling book, certainly, and for the first time introduce Westerners to the outline of the life of the Buddha. Soyen Shaku from Japan will attend the historic World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893 and bring Buddhism with him, as well as his very able translator, scholar Daisetsu Suzuki. While Japanese and Chinese immigrants had brought Buddhism to the New World, to the United States, this popular Buddhism first appears in San Francisco in 1853. But now we're in a period where great scholars are coming to the New World to teach more authentic forms of Buddhism to which Westerners had not had access before this time. And of course, the kind of Buddhism that is coming to the New World is from all sorts of sources. Many traditions from Sri Lanka to Japan, later Tibet, will pour into North America, making the Buddhist situation quite confusing. Daisetsu Suzuki, though himself very formal and proper, and a Zen scholar in his own right, will translate the entire Lotus Sutra of such importance to East Asians. But he will also attract a motley crew, one might say, of unusual Americans attracted to Buddhism, some of whom will emerge into American popular culture Hall of Fame. During the World War II period, as part of the Axis exchange between Japan and Germany, they also exchanged philosophers as well. And so, one of Japan's foremost philosophers of the 20th century, Keiji Nishitani, studied existentialism with Martin Heidegger, and the influence could well have gone both ways. But notably, Nishitani realizes that Western atheism is a meditation on Christianity, and that existentialism never escapes the prison of the self, even though it acknowledges the primacy of our existence as a self in the world. So while God is gone with existentialism, the self remains in his insightful work, Religion and Nothingness. Again, another explicit follower of Buddhism was Aldous Huxley, and he wrote a novel called Island, in 1960, where he describes an imaginary Mahayana Buddhist island where people can understand the birds and everyone lives in a total harmony of peace. Myna birds say, "Wake up," on that island. And of course he idealizes Buddhism, but as we can see, speaks explicitly of emptiness, zero-ness of all entities in this quantum foam universe. And he speaks of shunyata, or emptiness, the non-substantiality of our world, as exactly the Zen thinkers do, as ta-ta-ta, or suchness. This world we see is real, but it's empty of self-existence. So Suzuki will spawn a whole movement through his American followers, the beatniks, famous for playing bongos and smoking marijuana. These liminal figures at the outside, at the edges of American society, will become enormously influential. And in this period emerges America's most famous Buddhist, Alan Watts. He too becomes a cult icon in the culture, having begun his career as an Episcopalian minister. He became disillusioned with Christianity, fleeing to escape the tyranny of the Father God, as he put it. And of course, many formal Asian Buddhists will look down on him and other members of the Beat generation for drinking and doing drugs and all of this. But this was part of the American experience of Buddhism, and part, as they saw it, of opening the consciousness to an infinite universe. The Buddhist Holocaust we discussed in Unit 6, when the Chinese invade Tibet, killing a third of the population, 1 million people, also resulted in a diaspora of Tibetan Buddhist teachers. Among these, Geshe Ngawang Wangyal will instruct many Americans in the esoteric nature of Tantric or Vajrayana Buddhism. And Chogyam Trungpa will be involved in many sexual scandals as well as drug and alcohol abuse. Nevertheless, his followers will tell you this is part of his crazy wisdom, where he breaks the rules to bring about a more positive result based on breaking the rules. A bit of a distortion, perhaps, of tantric approaches. Another big appeal Buddhism has for modern Westerners is what is seen to be its feminist values. Now, we saw throughout our series women have been second class to the male monks in Buddhist tradition. And these feminists from America caused troubles for a number of traditional Asian teachers. But Buddhism for these feminists is a liberation from the Father God, or the idea of a male ultimate principle. And the individualism and practical aspects of it are among many reasons many women in the West see Buddhism as feminist. Because of the doctrine of Pratitya Samutpada, we looked at Unit 1 and the original Buddha himself. Things are co-originating and interrelated. This means that I do not exist apart from my environment. And so this doctrine of Buddhist environmentalism gets carried over socially into the economic concerns for environmentalism, as well as, of course, the concerns we all have to continue surviving on our planet. But environmentalists will often see in Buddhism an environmentally friendly tradition. And out of this mixture of Buddhism meeting with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, even in the West, just as in the Hellenistic period, we saw the collision of Greek and Indian and Scythian cultures all mix and merge to create new forms of Buddhism in Central Asia that will become become Mahayana traditions. Likewise, in the West, we'll see traditions of Buddhism that never existed before, such as the Jew Bu or Jewish Buddhist. In the book The Jew and the Lotus, one can find a chronicle of many reasons why Jewish people find Buddhism, but also Zen Catholicism was a minor classic, and then Engaged Buddhism is a kind of Buddhism that's involved in the world with social concerns. Unfairly, many Westerners will call Buddhism not socially engaged, but this is not correct. The Buddha himself was very socially engaged with the problems of women and the laypersons and up to the kings and the like. But nevertheless, in the modern period, many Buddhists are seeing a kind of Protestant emphasis on action in the social world that is perhaps a uniquely Protestant Christian approach to Buddhism. And the most famous exemplar of engaged Buddhism would be Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, who persuaded Martin Luther King to oppose the Vietnam War as a symbol of the oppression by colonial powers, not unlike the kind of oppression his own African Americans had suffered. Like Christianity, with the World Council of Churches and all the religions now have world congresses, and so the World Fellowship of Buddhists was founded in 1952 when the Dalai Lama fled Tibet for the West to India. Then he becomes almost equated with Buddhism, even though his position is hardly what the Buddha taught. The idea of incarnating God-man returning to nations to lead them. Nevertheless, he will set the stage for how so many perceive Buddhism to receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. Finally, another thing that appeals to many Westerners about Buddhism is that it does not, in their minds, conflict with science. So the idea of emptiness and the universe like a foam or a bubble is not unlike the quantum foam physicists discuss. A black hole kind of fits the description of Shunyata in a way, full of potential and yet empty of self-existence as a singularity. Then Albert Einstein famously saw Buddhism as consonant with science and nature and devoid of dogma, at least relative to the world in which he was raised in the West. I myself am a product of the University of Wisconsin's own Buddhist Studies program, the first in the world that sought to bring international scholars of Buddhism to teach and study and research in one institution. And so I was very fortunate to have access to a number of perspectives from Asia on Buddhism. While in the modern Buddhist world, a lot of young people I meet are finding themselves weary of Buddhism, in the West, this is a radical, revolutionary type of philosophy that has not been seen before and strikes Westerners as radical. So we shall see where Buddhism ends up as part of the tapestry of global worldviews. I'm pretty certain Buddhism will be around at least as long as there are humans. So with that, we say farewell to Buddhism for now and look forward to its unfolding evolution in the future.